Welcome to the brand new Red Star Ministry official podcast. This is our first episode, and it'll be a bit of an introduction to Christian Maoism, or Maoist Christianity, take your pick. We also touch on a few other topics like Jesus' teachings on the family and trans liberation. Red Star Ministry is a revolutionary Christian organization dedicated to synthesizing Marxist and Christian praxis in order to follow Jesus in liberating the oppressed. Find us at redstarministry.org and on Facebook, YouTube, and Patreon. I'm Christian.
I'm Hildegard.
Okay, so today we are going to be talking about one of Red Star's foundational essays, which is titled Why Christian Maoism. You can read this on our website at redstarministry.org. If you hit the blog button, it's up there. So this blog begins with a kind of provocative quote. It says, Jesus was a communist. Jesus was a capitalist. Jesus was a Republican. Jesus was a Democrat. Jesus was a liberal, was a conservative, was an anarchist, was a Nazi, right? So it's this idea, we wanted to get right into it at the beginning with what we mean by Christian Maoism and make very clear that we are not actually saying that, making a historical claim that Jesus was a Maoist, right?
Jesus was not a Maoist, and that's okay because we're not claiming that he was. But what Jesus was a revolutionary in his own time, and what Jesus sought to do in his ministry was uplift the oppressed, the marginalized, the colonized, and those oppressed by patriarchy. And I think you can't possibly follow Jesus without also doing those things. And that means you have to fundamentally reject any kind of reading of scripture that is in any way literal of what you ought to do to specific groups of people. Like Jesus helping lepers is a big deal because lepers were extremely marginalized. That doesn't really apply today in our current situation, organizing politically in America, because you look around, there aren't a whole lot of lepers in the streets. But what there are is there's oppressed people of all types, there's marginalized people of all types, there's people the world over. And I think in order to follow Jesus, you need to have an understanding of who those people are and what the structures oppressing them are and how they work. And that's where Maoism comes in. Marxism in general is a science for explaining that and for engaging with that in action. If you look at the Bible literally and just look at it in terms of lepers, you can say, well, there's no lepers living on my block. I can just be nice to my evangelical neighbors and all the people making six-figure salaries living on my block, and no one else matters because I'm nice to my neighbor who lives next to me, who thinks the same things I do. And you don't really challenge any of the structures that Jesus sought to.
Right. It's this idea that you run into when you talk about, this is just an example, but in translation, and this comes up a lot in biblical translations rather. There's this concept of dynamic equivalence, right? Where it's instead of taking the literal translation of a word that, literally when it was used in biblical times, it might have had a specific meaning, like leper, for example. We are not looking to translate that literally to the modern time because whatever word that is, even though it's the same word, it has completely different connotations in the 21st century as it would have, hundreds or thousands of years ago. So you translate it to a word that is not necessarily a literal translation, but it gets closer to the actual intended contextual meaning. And that is kind of how we look at the calling to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, to take up his cross, things like that.
And I think an excellent example of that is the word eunuch, which famously gets used by Christ, and as a metaphor for becoming like eunuchs in service to God. And of course, this has historically been interpreted to mean like vows of chastity, and that's not wrong in terms of what Jesus was saying. But what's missing is the fact that that eunuchs at that time were a gender minority. They were a pariah class along gendered lines that were not allowed in temple. And him comparing holiness to eunuchs was a very provocative and countercultural statement at the time that's completely missing if you just kind of read it dry today. And I think you can get that same meaning applying to trans people today. Obviously, I'm trans, are hated by so much of mainstream Christianity, and especially along these literalist lines of interpretation of the Bible. And the comparison to eunuchs doesn't necessarily apply that every eunuch was literally transgender, but the cultural and social conditions are very much the same, in that there's a gender minority that is oppressed by patriarchy, that is kept out of religious and civic institutions. And Jesus was using that as a metaphor for holiness. And I think we need to really wrestle with what that means and how that applies today. You can go way too far in either direction. You can say that eunuchs are literally trans, or you can say that, no, it was just a metaphor for chastity, and both are not correct, but you have to engage with how that translates sociopolitically. And that the main thesis of why Christian Maoism is that you have to use sociological sciences to engage with these topics. You can't just do it based on vibes. You have to look at how oppression works in the 21st century, globally and locally. And Maoism, as a political movement and as a methodology, is what really empowers us to do that today.
Yeah, and I just want to add that, I mean, it not only helps us understand oppression in the 21st century, but it also helps us understand oppression throughout history, and going back to biblical times, to the times of the Hebrew Bible. And it's where it's a tool that you can use to analyze that history and understand, lepers weren't oppressed because they had boils or facial disfiguration, and they weren't oppressed because of issues of infectious disease, which the people back then didn't have any understanding of, right? But it's tied to class society, and it's tied to ideas about religion and religious purity. The same with eunuchs. And I want to say also, I want to throw a book recommendation in there for people, who may be listening and thinking, well, is eunuch really like an oppressed sexual minority back in the time? There's a great book. It's not about first century Palestine, but it's called Against Sex: Identities of Sexual Restraint in Early America by Kara French. And it's a really great book that looks at how people who, usually for religious reasons, cut themselves off from what is considered normal sexual activity, even just people who practice not having sex, kind of draw the ire of patriarchal society writ large. So this is not, people did not treat sexual abstinence as like, oh, it's a personal choice, right? Anyone making that choice for themselves did bring a lot of scrutiny and oppression on themselves. So it's a very important thing for us all to learn about.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because the thing is that in order for civilization in the first century to exist at all, the average AFAB had to reproduce exponentially, because with so much child mortality, so many stillbirths. If you were giving birth, you were lucky if you lived through the process at all. And so there was this incredible pressure on people who are assigned female at birth that it was foundational to the structure of their society, and marriages were based upon a literal male head of household who would, not just in, like, we think of medieval Europe, like kings marrying their cousins and things like that for political reasons, but just in general, these houses were extended families. When you see in the Bible them talking about families, they're not talking about 2.5 kids and a dog. They're talking about a household with a patriarch of multiple generations who oversees everything and tells everybody else what to do. And Jesus actively sought to destroy this. This is why so much of the original Jesus movement was women. And this is the power of what chastity at that time sought to do. It was to liberate them from this cycle of birth and death, to say, you have control over your own body. You don't have to reproduce. And I think chastity in that day and age is very different than the sort of sex negativity we encounter today. Even in my grandmother's time, people in the 50s were told, don't get attached to your kids before age 4.
Yeah.
Like, this is in, like, the quote unquote first world. This was just the general medical reality. Modern contraceptives are about 100 years old. And that is such a huge game changer in terms of how we engage with sex, because for so many people, sex equals the potentiality of death because of the potentiality of death in childbirth. And so the draw for chastity in the first century was not the sort of sex negativity we think of today. It was this liberation from having to engage with that at all. I mean, so many of these, like, there's so many martyr hagiographies, myths about saints, or some historical facts about saints, that just starts with, they wanted to marry such and such to a pagan king, and she refused. And that really just means, she doesn't want to get raped by some dude she doesn't fucking know. and like, there's real power in that. There's real feminism in that. There's real gender liberation in that. But if you just take that as sex is bad, that doesn't work right now. That doesn't work in 2025, because our entire relationship to sex and procreation is completely changed by birth control of all sorts. And
I would also add by just the modicum of independence that women have been able to kind of fight for and win for themselves over the past 100 or so years, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't remember the exact date. Perhaps we can look it up and after the fact. But, like, marital rape was in America was I think declared illegal in the 80s. Like
1993.
93, okay. And it was either late 80s or early 90s.
So after I was born. That is insane.
Yeah, it's totally insane. And it's mind-boggling even to think about. I'll never forget this one older woman who opened up to me, and she was just telling me about her life. And she was a widow, and she said, I love my husband. He never bothered me for sex. He went somewhere else for that.
Jesus.
And it's like, yeah, but this was considered a blissful marriage.
Right. And
the world is...
Yeah, and that notion of family, I don't want to say like it completely originates, from the Roman Empire, but a lot of these structures that we still think of today and associate with family were kind of codified during the Roman Empire that Jesus lived under as a subject of, right? And
well,
go ahead.
I would disagree with that point very strongly because family in the Roman Empire was extremely multi-generational, and the modern idea of family as generally understood in America really originated in the 1950s. The nuclear family is the way to separate every generation from each other, because that means if everyone buys a house, that means everyone has to buy a blender, everyone has to buy their own shovel, and
Absolutely.
everyone's buying more stuff.
Yes, no, you are 100% correct about that. I did not mean the nuclear family per se. I mean the idea of a family as a distinct unit in society, which is like inherently patriarchal and hierarchical, right? So if you look at earlier human societies or civilizations who were in a stage of like what Engels would call barbarism, it was much less about individual families, even though you were right, those families were not nuclear families with mom, dad, 2.5 children, and the dog and the white picket fence, but they were still run by, you know, a head of household who was the paterfamilias, who had kids and they all lived together, and he kind of was like the lord over this family unit. Very different from the types of family units we think of today, but still like a distinct unit. Whereas if you go back further, a lot of these familial ties were a lot more based on like clans, you know, like networks of families working together. Yeah. And they were a lot more, I don't want to say they were completely egalitarian, because that's obviously not true, but they were much more egalitarian than the notion of the family that even we today think of.
Sure. And if you go as far back as to like the Paleolithic times, there's evidence to suggest that Engels was right all along, that they didn't split up jobs according to gender. All that, like men hunt, women gather.
Right.
Fucking bullshit. It's the archaeological evidence just like a couple years ago strongly suggests that, you know, the specialization of jobs was not split according to gender, no. Which is where gender inequality began, which is this specialization of labor.
And also gathering was much more important than hunting. Like, it was by far, you know, I think I saw this estimate that was like 80% of a tribe's or a clan's food would come from gathering, and the hunting would be like more of a supplementary thing.
That makes a lot of sense, and especially because I think it was pretty much the 20th century, or maybe the late 19th. It was like the first time in history where meat kind of became like the cornerstone of diet. It was up until that point, it was seen as a luxury.
Yeah, cheese was the primary source of protein for like most poor people in medieval Europe, right? And in classical Europe, even in like China and Asia, they used soy. So like they would find other protein sources. Meat was never the primary source of protein until very recent history.
Okay. I did want to dial back just for just 1 second, because we were talking about the Roman sort of ideal of the family, and I would just like to, you know, clarify that that's kind of where our biblical and cultural ideas of family originated in the Western tradition, but there's a whole world, and it's not like, and there's other models of oppressive patriarchal families that don't mirror that precisely, though they, you know, share some characteristics. I think that distinction is important, that like Rome and Greece didn't create the world, they didn't invent civilization. And
right.
I know that you know that, I know that, most of our listeners probably know that, but it's just sort of this weird like trad West concept that civilization didn't exist anywhere else, like
right
prior to Athens.
Whereas what really happened is the Greeks and the Romans, they defined civilization as themselves, and then kind of uncritically this Western tradition arose in the early modern era that kind of said, yes, they created civilization, and we are going to define civilization based on them. And so, yeah, I think a lot of the modern history of the West is the ruling class is very consciously trying to recreate structures that they saw as originating in Greece and Rome. Doesn't matter that they don't know that those structures usually have antecedents in Egypt or Phoenicia or like the Near East, right? So they see
even
go ahead.
so even that I would argue that no medieval scholars at all understood what those structures even were. They didn't have the technology to compare manuscripts side by side. They were just sort of taking guesses in the dark. So
That's why you don't see this really arise until the early modern era, when that kind of thing, when Petrarch was it who like rediscovers the classics, right, and kind of kicks off what we think of as the Renaissance. That's where this idea comes from. You can even see that in walk around Washington D.C. and look at the neoclassical architecture. It's not a secret or a controversial thing to say that they were, the American founding fathers were very inspired by the idea of civilization that they kind of constructed out of ideas about Rome and Greece.
Sure, just the very idea of the House and the Senate was like constructed to emulate that as let's recreate the democracy that they had back then, when there were slaves, because there were also slaves. And America was founded on slavery.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to notice that because, their ideas about democracy and civilization were so wrapped up in this Greco-Roman construction of the early modern era, they never saw any contradiction between slavery and democracy and civilization. The idea of liberal democracy was never, ever at any point seen as contradictory with the existence of slavery. Maybe some of the far left wing of the French Revolution had some ideas about that, but for the most part, the bourgeoisie was never fundamentally in contradiction with slavery.
Yeah, that's why Thomas Paine was pretty much the only one, and he pretty much died in exile from all the other founding fathers, and for about
States,
in the American quote unquote revolution,
right.
But let's get back to Maoism, because I could talk about this for hours.
Yeah, we'll have to do a whole episode on Jesus and the family. That's one of my favorite topics. But yes, for now we'll go back to why Christian Maoism. So I want to pose. Why don't we start with what is Maoism, right? So I think a lot of people, and this is important to talk about, a lot of people maybe have outdated ideas about what Maoism is based on, the New Left movement and, the era of world politics when Mao was alive and when the Cultural Revolution was happening. So a lot of people still connect Maoism with that. And you see that with these liberal commentators who say that Trump is really a Maoist, right? So I think there's some ideas that are based on that. And then there's also, maybe younger leftists whose experience of Maoism comes from people like Redgard's Austin, and the kind of people that I personally and others would call Gonzaloists, or principally Maoists is what they call themselves, I think. So I think it's a good idea. Maybe we talk about how we understand Maoism and kind of draw some lines of demarcation between us and these kind of other ideas. The idea that Maoism is, the ideology based on the great proletarian cultural revolution in the 1960s and 70s, and that it's kind of fundamentally tied to that era of communist history, that is a mistake. That is not what people mean when they refer to Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, which is what we shorthand to just Maoism, right? So Maoism, also known as Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, MLM, one of the MLMs, one of the two good ones, what we would call to refer to that era in the 60s and 70s, we sometimes refer to as anti-revisionist Marxism, Leninism, or Mao Zedong thought. So that is kind of the ideology. I don't really even think it's a living ideology. It's kind of just this historical idea that is tied to that era of communist politics. Maoism, as we understand it, originated as a distinct strain in communist thought in the 1980s, really. And it came from there were certain parties, usually in third world countries. So the one that everybody talks about is the Shining Path. And there are also Maoist movements in India, the Naxalites, Nepal, who the less we say about that one, the better. And there's also a still very strong movement ongoing in the Philippines. And there were, small Maoist parties that arose in, all throughout the world, kind of following in the footsteps of these ones, especially the Shining Path and the movement in the Philippines and India. Those are kind of the big three of modern Marxism-Leninism, Maoism.
I definitely want to draw attention to Maoism in the Philippines because they're extremely active today and extremely active in pushing developments in Christian liberation theology because Philippines is an extraordinarily Catholic country, and a few years ago they published a 500-page compendium to the Catholic social doctrine and how parts of that can be used to radicalize the peasantry in a communist direction. And I think that's an example we can all draw inspiration from. We in America obviously don't live in a homogenous country where it's all one tradition that we can necessarily draw from. But I think that is an excellent example of just the way they scientifically went to the people and looked at, these church doctrines and said, what can we use to further the revolution? And that brings us to the mass line. So I want to break down just Maoism, what it is in terms of just methodologically. It's a trinity, really. There's, yes, I know. There's a People's Army, which America doesn't have. There's a vanguard party, which America doesn't have. And there's a Democratic Front, which of forward-facing legal institutions that are engaging with every strand of civic life possible and gathering information and aiding people through the resources available through the party. And it's sort of a back and forth. And the whole idea behind this sort of trinity is almost like a checks and balances of sorts, in that a party has to be rooted in the masses, in the people. And that means there has to be a constant feedback loop between those who are on the ground doing the work, engaging with the people, and those who are directing the party. I mean, historically, this has the roots in just the Chinese Communist Party and its revisionist politics and the Cultural Revolution, just seeking to engage with the people of China and encouraging sort of a revolt against the party itself.
Right.
And I think that it's sort of a combination of a Marxist-Leninist top-down organizing and a more anarchistic horizontal approach that encourages sort of general insurgency and sort of keeps the party on its toes. Now, obviously, we don't have a People's Army. We don't have in America, we don't have, we don't have a guerrilla army. We don't have a vanguard party. And we at Red Star are positioning ourselves as part of a Democratic Front in furtherance in hope of a future vanguard party. And what we are doing is doing the mass line on the terrain of Christian theology. Now, what is the mass line? Mass line is basically where these Democratic Front or just forward-facing institutions that work directly with the people along various wide variety of cultural backgrounds, just specific situations, and talks to them and engages them in civic politics, brings them into the party, and then reports back their needs to the party, and the party can then create a program that is ideologically consistent with the advancing of the revolution. And then that comes back down. It's a sort of up and down process. And what we are starting to do at Red Star is a sort of mass line along theological terrain. Now, what does that look like? Well, we recently have started a program to engage with progressive churches on trans issues, and hopefully to radicalize them into political action. And in 2025, there's a lot of people who are looking to do that, who are desperate to do that. And we are networking with various left-leaning clergy, and we are talking about the needs of their congregations. And we obviously are not a centralized party, that are directing these clergy, but we are engaging with these sort of issues, and in the hopes of radicalizing already progressive churches towards actual political activism in favor of trans people who are so under attack by just Christofascism and right-wing theology today. It's a desperately needed thing that has to happen in order for trans liberation to be possible, because we have to chisel away at this weird fascist transphobic bullshit. And so part of the mass line is just sort of engaging with those churches and the needs of their congregations, and working to mobilize them towards already existing, leftist protests in support of trans people. Another thing is incredibly informal, but as we have developed an online presence and a sort of small following for our theological essays, people write to us. They ask us questions. They ask us about this verse or that verse. They say, this quote from Ephesians about women is really bothering me, and I can't see a way past it. How do you contextualize it? How do you get past it? And we answer those questions. And I wouldn't go so far as to say that we are, the absolute authority, but we are engaging in this terrain and using our collective knowledge as an organization, as we have a sort of a committee of multiple members of lay and clergy to sort of engage with these questions. And so often it just comes down to like really simple stuff that should have been answered 40 years ago, stuff that was answered 40 years ago. People will be like, can I be gay and Christian? Can I be trans and Christian? And there's just so many resources that are already out there for that. And there is a great deal of writing on that. And, we can point them in that direction. And there's other organizations and other resources that are doing tremendous work on that as we are. But like, this is the sort of thing where when people come to us with these questions, it lets us know as an organization where the people are, what theological issues need to be wrestled with, apart from the ones that would be the most obvious.
Yeah, I just want to, on the last thing you said, I would say that kind of me coming from this very progressive Christian background, right? Like the church that I grew up in was a UCC church, which is one of the most progressive churches. Although my family was not that deep into it, it's kind of the vision of Christianity that I had growing up. So, when we started Red Star and we would get these messages from people, they were asking questions about stuff that me, in my mind, I'm like, why is this even an issue for you? I've heard a million arguments about why it's okay to be gay and Christian my whole life. I've known gay Christians since I was a child, right? But in a lot of parts of this country and a lot of parts of the world, that is not people's common experience of Christianity. That is not like a normal thing for a lot of people to hear. So it kind of gave me the perspective that I really needed to get out of my liberal bubble and realize, like, oh no, this Christo-fascism has a much stronger grip on huge parts of the world than I maybe in my naivety realized. And also I want to, to loop it back to Maoism. First of all, challenging Christian transphobia would be, worth doing no matter what. It's just worth doing for its own sake. But at the same time, it is also a key component of class struggle, right? It's not this kind of like liberal, identitarian, we just care about trans people because we are trans people, right? But it is a key part of working class politics. The vast majority of trans people are working class. Liberation of all people is a working class ideology because we know that the oppression of the working classes ultimately is the root of all oppression in the world. And we also should be able to have seen the past few years how the American fascist movement has weaponized transphobia specifically, like very explicitly transphobia, in order to gain real political power for itself and to really erode the neoliberal order that has kind of been dominant for the past 20 years. And Christianity, the right wing almost near monopoly on Christianity in public discourse in the United States has played a huge role in that. So anywhere where fascists, are fighting, we have to meet them on that terrain and fight back against it. Part of Maoist military theory is to hit the enemy where they're weak and retreat where they're strong. And we believe that there are weaknesses in their ideology and in their anti-trans campaign that, if we had an opposition party in this country, if the Democratic Party was at all interested in actually fighting the Republicans and fighting fascism, they could have exploited this weakness, but instead they just run from it at every opportunity they get. So we see an opening there where we can not only push back against this fascist movement, but also build working class politics and teach the people who we are going to be working with on this campaign how to actually organize an anti-fascist and revolutionary movement. So that is kind of the point, and that's really what the Democratic Front, which I want to add is sometimes called the United Front. So if you encounter United Front, Democratic Front, those are referring to the same idea. But that's where the idea of the United or Democratic Front comes in. That is the purpose of it, right? It is to build working class power, and it is to kind of unite all of the progressive elements in a society under communist leadership. In an American context where we don't have that communist leadership, as Hildegard mentioned, we don't have a vanguard party right now. It also creates the conditions for revolutionary leadership to emerge, because in order to be a good revolutionary leader, you need to have experience leading people. So out of campaigns like this, and I'm not necessarily saying, this specific Red Star Ministry campaign, but out of these kinds of struggles is where real revolutionary leadership that can kind of take us to the next stage of anti-fascism and of revolution can emerge from.
Oh, I totally agree. And I think that on a side note, so much of the left is often disheartened by our repeated failures, especially since we look to the 70s and see so much revolutionary activity. But I think what people are failing to notice in that pessimism is that where we are today is a result of people learning, because we have an entire generation or two that was completely cut off from any sort of like activism, especially in a working class terrain, and definitely in a revolutionary terrain. But like Occupy Wall Street was sort of a beginning, and people engaged in it. It brought people to the left, it failed, people learned. There was no clear messaging or demands. We see other waves of Black Lives Matter sort of waxing from about 2012 to about 2020, and then it gets completely co-opted by the Democratic Party, and people, obviously feel very disheartened by that. But the same people who are working on one campaign move on to another. And what do we see with the campus protests? Protesting the genocide in Palestine, we see a reemergence of Occupy tactics. Let's set up camp in the campus. Let's pitch tents here. And it's obviously they didn't use the word occupy because it has a very different meaning in an anti-Zionist struggle. But we see just so much that has been learned from people, not just on the street tactics in terms of avoiding or just outmaneuvering the police, but just in terms of messaging. There's like Marxist literature on the ground being distributed in these contexts, and it's happening alongside so many other things, both Muslim services, Jewish services, in solidarity with one another. And one tent over, you've got a screening of Battle for Algiers. So people are drawing these lines together. They're making the connections and they're gaining experience. And so while it's just so easy to look at, the modern left as just this never-ending cascade of failures, people are learning, and people can only learn through experience. If you look at the Russian Revolution, there was just revolutionary activity going on from the 1860s, and people generally remember 1917 as though it happened out of nowhere, and
right, it's the 10 days that shook the world, right? It's just 10 days.
Yeah. Or sometimes they'll rightfully bring up 1905.
Yeah.
But
right. How many people even know that Lenin was inspired to be a revolutionary by his older brother being killed for revolutionary activity when he was a child, right? In the 1800s. I think the 1880s that was.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's so frustrating about organizing today is that you see so many, especially whenever there's a crisis, liberals pour in with their quote unquote brand new ideas, and they think they know everything, and they try to reinvent the wheel, and they're all just pitching ideas that failed in the 1870s. And it's kind of like everyone wants to write a book on the revolution before they read one.
Right.
And there's just, I don't want to, if I start talking about like sort of 1860 to 1905, I'll be talking for hours. but read What Is to Be Done by Lenin, 1902, and you'll see why everyone around him was wrong. But the point is, we need to engage with this revolutionary history, and it's none of this exists in a bubble. We need to look at tactics that failed before and see why they failed and improve upon them. And I think that's kind of the great task of the revolution today. I don't think that in 2026 there'll be a great global proletarian revolution. I think our task is to build working class power that can be used as our material conditions sharpen and worsen, especially with climate change, and of course the political, conditions of just sort of neo-fascism emerging like everywhere. The point is that the Russian Revolution had decades of other organizations that were already on the ground, and they were obviously competing for power. And you have 2025, Trump's been inaugurated for the second time, and you have all these groups emerging out of nowhere, with all these ideas of what they should do. Hey, let's not buy anything for a day. What the fuck was that?
Right.
Like February 28th, our power isn't in our labor. It's just, let's spread a meme about how you shouldn't buy anything.
Yeah, it's not in our labor, it's our purchasing power, it's our activity as consumers. You see this in the same way that, like strikes and scabbing have been completely recontextualized to be about boycotts, right? Like scabbing is no longer going in and undercutting striking workers by working at the company. It's somehow morphed into being about like shopping at a store where the workers are engaged in any kind of labor struggle. And it redirects the power of a strike to being about consumers and consuming, and rather than about actual labor. Sorry, just go ahead. That's something I feel passionate about.
No. I agree, and I think boycotts definitely have their place.
Sure.
And BDS for anti-Zionist action is pretty much outlawed in a lot of civic activity. A lot of government employees have to sign an oath that they won't boycott Israel personally, but globally it's having a tremendous effect, on Israel's economy. And obviously, we could do a whole episode, on Israel Palestine, and I think
I'm sure we will.
Yeah, we should. Yeah, it's a topic that we're just sort of grazing upon, and I don't think it's something that we can just sort of like. We're flipping a lot of ideas, casually in a few sentences when there's huge context that needs to be delved into for listeners who might not already 100% agree with us, who need to know the context, who need to know why we have the position that we do or what that position even is. And I do think we need, you and I are having a casual conversation.
Yeah.
And I think these things are definitely all connected. But in order to connect the dots, we need a little bit more background story, and just perhaps we can record those separately. Perhaps there'll obviously be separate episodes. But for now, let's move back to why Christian Maoism. I think we've pretty much. So let's summarize what we've discussed so far. That Jesus of Nazareth in his time was about not only materially aiding, but organizing the oppressed, the marginalized, the colonized, along both economic and gender and sociological lines. I think it's pretty clear to anyone who reads the Bible with any sort of through any sort of liberatory lens, and I think most of our listeners will pretty much agree with us there off the bat.
Yeah.
We can't translate who those people are into the 21st century, and we need sociological sciences to determine who the oppressed are, because otherwise you get a bunch of fucking assholes who say that Christians are the oppressed, white people are the real oppressed people. You can just make up anything you want and just say, oh, well, Jesus thinks that.
But like the sheep and the goats parable is just about other Christians. I've heard that one a lot.
Yeah. And we need to really engage with the question, who's oppressing who and how? And Marxism provides tools for that. And what Maoism does, or Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, is provides the most advanced tools for organizing under those conditions, for making sure that any movement that we organize to liberate those oppressed people, and those oppressed people, including ourselves, has to have a sort of process whereby the top of the party is engaging with the bottom, where the masses are always engaged with the action of the party, and where there's always a mechanism not only to keep the party in check, but to keep the party advanced in terms of what's actually happening on the ground and how to push the revolution further. So that's Maoism at its core. And what Red Star Ministry is doing is we're positioning ourselves as a forward-facing organization working in the terrain of Christian theology, specifically not only on defense of combating Christofascism and specifically transphobia, but also putting forth a revolutionary vision for what Christianity can be, to drown out that sort of hegemony of just really insane right-wing ideas of what Christianity is supposed to be, and just really talk about liberating the oppressed, and to engage with that as an organization on the ground level. Basically, we're doing battle on a theological terrain, and we're engaging in material struggles of people, of communities of which we are a part, on trans issues specifically, not just because so many members of our committee are trans, but because it's such a important topic today. It's sort of a cornerstone of fascist ideology. It's drawing in so-called feminists. It's drawing in all these conservative-leaning people and just people who think that Christianity should be about man is man, woman is woman, ooga 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 booga dumb fucking shit. I don't know, but the point is that we are engaging specifically on this sort of terrain. And I think that is why we've kind of moved past the article that we're actually supposed to be basing this episode on, but have gone on all sorts of tangents, which have been fun. But we wrote this essay a couple years ago, Why Christian Maoism, but it should really be called Why Maoist Christianity.
Yeah.
And I think this is an important distinction because so many well-meaning Christians with revolutionary impulses are kind of at their core thinking, how can I bring Christianity to the revolution? How can I engage with revolutionary politics in a Christian way, when what we really should be asking is, how can we be Maoing Christ? How can we bring this modern method of organizing into the living revolutionary spirit of what Jesus of Nazareth started 2,000 years ago?
1,000%. Yeah, we are intervening within Christianity first and foremost, not trying to, bring Christianity into communist politics necessarily. I just want to add, maybe we can close with this, or if you have more afterwards, please, by all means. I want to highlight one line of the Why Christian Maoism essay, which once again you can find at redstarministry.org if you hit the blog tab. It says, having correct ideas only matters to the extent that you can and do act upon them. This is a fundamental Maoist idea, and it was actually this idea that, when I first got over my left communist phase and started reading Mao, when I encountered this idea that, is present in Marxism since the time of Marx, but Mao really stresses, he has this short little, it's just really just one paragraph, but it's like a short little work called Where Do Correct Ideas Come From? And it's exactly this, from where do correct ideas come from? Do they drop from the skies? No. Are they innate in the mind? No. They come from social practice and from it alone. This is the stage, the knowledge gained through firsthand experience is applied in social practice to ascertain whether theories, policies, plans, or measures meet with the anticipated success. So that is how Marxists judge the correctness of ideas and of theories in social practice. And it just, when I studied this, it immediately reminded me of, a teaching from the Gospel of Matthew when Jesus says, are grapes gathered from thorns or figs from thistles? In the same way, every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. And it's the same idea. It's a bad theory cannot produce good results in the world, and a good theory cannot produce bad results in the world. So all of these ideas that we have about Christ, about Maoism and Marxism, and about how to build a revolution, we have to test them in social practice. I hope nobody is, listening to this and thinking like, oh, these ideas suck, they won't work, or oh, these ideas are great, I'm going to listen to everything these people say. Like, no, all of this has to and will be tested through social practice. And that is what Red Star Ministry is, planning and hoping to do.
Amen.
All right, this has been Red Star Ministry. Thank you, Hildegard. Do you have any closing thoughts?
Not in particular. I kind of scattered them throughout this episode since we were all over the place a little bit.
No, and you know what? If you're listening, get used to it, because that's probably how most of these episodes are going to go. So, yeah.
Yeah, and we could structure other ones, especially if we have a guest. We'll structure them more around.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Questions.
We'll have questions and things like that.
Yeah, and we can direct and be directed depending on the topic. But this is just sort of us going all over the place about what we stand for.
Yep. All right. Until next time, thank you so much for listening.
Okay, love and solidarity.
Jesus Christ was a man that traveled through the land, hard-working man and brave. He said to the rich, give your goods to the poor, so they laid Jesus Christ in his grave. Yes.
The Red Star Ministry podcast's opening theme is Desert Rats by Dissociative Realism. Find them on Bandcamp. And if you'd like to support Red Star Ministry and the work we do, including this podcast, you can find us at patreon.com/Red Star Ministry. We are also online at our own website, redstarministry.org, and at facebook.com or youtube.com/Red Star Ministry. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time.
They laid Jesus Christ in his grave.